Hi, Deep in the Reads, back for another video. And today I'm actually not going to be talking about a book specifically. I'm going to be doing a tag like a normie would do. The tag is the Philosophy of Reading tag, which was first started by Brendan's Bookshelf. And I first saw this tag done by Mary Jo Hedrick. I said to myself, I should do that. That sounds like an interesting tag. And here I am, half a year later, and I'm actually frickin' doing it. So anyway, the tag is 20 questions long, and it's basically trying to find out who you are as a reader and how you think about what you read and why you read it all and things like that. So without further ado, let's just do it. Let's go. I'm ready. Let's go. Number 1. What's most important? Character, plot, or message? Not to evade the question or anything, but I really do think that it's dependent on the author's intent. Like, an author will go into a book maybe wanting to prioritize one or the other, and so you should let the author's voice kind of guide you into what kind of book they want it to be. Having said that, there's a lot of books that I really enjoy. Like, some of my favorite novels are able to balance character and plot and message really, really well. So that's what I tend to hope for when I go into a book. But if I had to choose just one, it would be character, because I think a story will be so much weaker and so much less interesting and so much less immersive if the character isn't working. Whereas if the plot and the message is minimal, but the character is really strong and it's a good character study, then it can pull you right in. Number 2. Should one read books about ideas or opinions that they disagree with? I'd be curious to know if anybody who has done this tag has said no. Like, I kind of want to meet the person who genuinely believes that you should only read books that parrot your worldview back at you to make you feel good and completely coddle you. But of course, I think that it's good to read as much as you can, and that includes books that you disagree with, even books that you know you'll disagree with before you go into them. Because most of the time, when you go into a book, you don't know whether you'll agree with it or not. Like, when I picked up What is Art by Leo Tolstoy, I did not know that he would advocate for destroying and censoring any art that he didn't like. But I came away from that book with a broader understanding of different perspectives, and if I'm confronted with someone who holds those opinions, I'll be able to discuss and debate with them, because I'll be able to meet them on their terms better, I'll be able to understand their arguments, and be able to argue against them, to provide my own evidence. And, you know, that is, I think, a large part of the battle in turning people away from being closed-minded and being bigoted, is understanding their arguments and having enough of a education about, like, what they're going to say, that you can sort of preempt what they're going to say and say, would you be convinced if I told you this? Because you're meeting them where they are and you're talking to them, as opposed to talking past them and just morally grandstanding. Because when you do that, nobody ends up developing or learning anything. So yeah, it's very important to read books that you disagree with. Number 3. As tech advances, what do you think the role of books will be? Even if books are eventually relegated to just being sort of a novelty, like collecting vinyl, I still think that there will always be books and there will always be readers. It seems weird that a thing that has been around for thousands of years would just go away because computers showed up, you know? I personally way prefer reading physical books than ebooks or anything like that, because an ebook has batteries, an ebook can crash, an ebook can have, you know, technological problems like planned obsolescence. A book you can just open and read, so I'll always prefer, like, the feel and the aesthetic and the convenience of a good book. But yeah, I wouldn't worry about books going away anytime soon. Number 4. How important are summaries, reviews, and art in choosing your books? When it comes to nonfiction, I think reviews are extremely important, especially when it comes to history, and that's because you want to make sure that the author's methodology is good, you want to make sure that they're factual and they did their research, and if they have a bias, you want to be aware of what that bias is and how much it affects the writing. When I want to learn about a topic through a nonfiction book, I want to make sure that I'm getting the actual, like, proper information as opposed to being misinformed. When it comes to fiction, I'm a little bit looser, but I'm still not quite able to completely put the blindfold on and just do a blind pick. I tend to need to know something to tantalize me and pique my interest, so that when I start the book, I'm already off on a good foot because I know I want to be here reading this particular book because of what I already know about it. When it comes to artwork, like I love book artwork, and when I see a book cover that I really like, I still won't buy it. I'll want to know more about the book. Like I just learned about a book called A Fine Balance because I saw the cover and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I looked it up and it sounds really interesting. So now I'm like, oh yeah, I really need to read this book. So yeah, I'm not able to go into books blind, I guess. I need to know at least a little bit to get me into it. Number 5, should one ever skim or scan a book? I would say that skimming is actually a good skill to have if you're either doing research or you're studying, or if you're trying to refresh yourself on a part of a book that you've already read. However, when it comes to reading for pleasure and it's a book that you've never read before, I would say that skimming should definitely be avoided because you're going to miss out on so many nuances of the craft of writing. You're going to miss out on subtext and characterization, and you're not going to retain or remember nearly as well if you're skimming. So skimming certainly has its place, but it should be not used if you're reading for pleasure and you've never read it before. Number 6, should reading always be enjoyable? I'd say it all depends on why you're reading in the first place. Like, yeah, when it comes to booktubers, we're all reading for enjoyment. We're sitting on the couch on our own time. And so, yeah, when I read a book, it's based on personal enjoyment. But some other people might be reading for utilitarian reasons, like they're studying for a university degree, so they need to consult a textbook, or they need to look up a law, or whatever. Like, it's not entertaining, but it's useful to them. And sometimes you're just going to need to do that. And then there's other times where it's like, a lot of the books I read I really enjoy, but I almost hesitate to use that term because, like, if I'm reading a book on the Holocaust, I can't exactly go up to somebody and say, I'm having so much fun reading this book on the Holocaust. So yeah, it really depends on why you're reading. Not all reading needs to be enjoyable, but you should be getting something out of it. If not enjoyable, then it should be informative, for example. Number 7, is it important to be well-read? Yes, I would say that it's ideal and encouraged to be well-read, but it's not necessary. And I guess it also depends on the definition of well-read, because I imagine a lot of people will define well-read as saying that you've read like hundreds of books a year or whatever. But I think variety is more to the case, so you know, you might see someone reading all those books per year, but you turn out to see that, oh, they're basically reading the same type of book over and over again. I tend to look at it as like a variety, so like from different years, from different cultures, different languages, things like that. And I think the other thing about being well-read that's important is how you engage with the work. Like, how does it affect you? Are you spending time actually thinking about things like subtext, or are you just sort of like skimming the surface narrative and leaving it at that? So yeah, like, it's important to be well-read, but engagement and variety are also very important, so make sure you keep those things in mind when you're trying to be as well-read as possible. Number 8, what is your book buying process? I may be going against the grain here, but I don't really see the need to constantly be buying books. I tend to buy one book every 3 or 4 months, and when I do buy a book, it'll usually, well, it'll almost always be a used book, and it'll almost always be a non-fiction book, because those books take me too long to read for me to just borrow them from the library, and I usually want to like refer back to them or like make notes in the margins and things like that. So that's why I tend to buy physical books, and it tends to be rare because I basically exhaust all other options before I buy a book. Like, I make sure I can't get it at the library, I make sure that I can't get a PDF of it somewhere, I make sure I can't find an audio, whatever. But yeah, so I tend to not really buy books that often. Number 9, what is your reading process? I read every alternating day, I read at night, and I read for like 2 to 3 hour chunks. So every second day I just have a big like chunk of time where I can really zero in on a book. Number 10, how do you use what you read? The sort of insights that I get from reading are like, I can't even measure. Like, it helps stimulate the imagination, it helps you think critically, it helps sort of give you new perspectives and new worldviews to sort of tap into and have kind of mind melds with authors from all over the planet, all over time, and that's really an incredible experience. Sometimes you'll read a book that will change your perspective on something, like political books or philosophical books or whatever, or just history books that teach you the underpinnings of your own society, like the history, why you are where you are, how the world works. And then you'll see authors writing fiction, and that fiction is usually, in some way or another, some kind of reflection of the world they live in, their opinions of the world, and how they're affected by the world around them. So yeah, there's endless ways that I use what I read, and I think that for what I do as an artist, it's really important to engage with all types of artistic and creative media, whether it's writing, music, poetry, movies, like you name it. It's really important if you're a creative person to tap into what other creative types are doing. Number 11, if you could download a book to your brain, would you still read? I like the idea of having the option. I think that I would definitely do both. I would just inject all of the dull, informative textbooks like straight into my brain. Like all the math textbooks and science textbooks, just like get them in there because I want the information. Whereas I'd still get a lot of enjoyment out of physically reading a book because the craft of writing and the way it's paced and the way information is revealed to you for like dramatic effect or whatever is something that you can't really recreate with memory or whatever. So yeah, it would be nice to have the option and then use the different options for different scenarios. Number 12, what are your views on rereading a book? I would say that rereading is definitely important, especially if you recall that you loved a book but you can't really remember the details. Like that's the case for me with East of Eden, for example. And I also think it's really great to revisit books at different stages in your life because it can have a different kind of resonance with you. And especially when it comes to classics, the other advantage is that you might pick up on details or deeper themes that you may have missed on the first read-through. The only thing I would caution against, if there's a book that you particularly love and you read it like a million times, is don't let your complacency and familiarity for that book override your desire to also try new things. Question 13 and 14. What makes a good book and what makes a bad book? I really don't think that the quality of a book is dependent on one thing or the other. I think it's more of a nebulous interweaving of various elements and how they work together or how they don't work together. So like for fiction, it's things like character and plot and themes and prose. When it's nonfiction, it's things like how well researched it is, how informative it is, whether or not the author's being too meticulous or how engaging their writing is. And when you get all the right elements in the right place with the right attention, then you get great writing. But when you have a few elements that are completely out of whack, or an author who just isn't a wordsmith and can't hold your attention because they don't have good control of the language, then yeah, it's not going to be a good book. So it really isn't a matter of one thing. It's really a combination of all these things and how the author utilizes all of them. Number 15, how do you feel about not finishing a book? Well, I'll say this much, I should definitely DNF more often. I don't know what it is, I guess I'm stubborn, but I will suffer through just about any novel, no matter how bad it is, and I don't know if that's a good thing, but I never regret reading a book. The only books that I tend to DNF are nonfiction books that are way over my head. Like, I tried to read a master's level Japanese history book called Sengoku Jidai, and oh my god, I've never read a more complicated book. I needed like charts and graphs just to keep track of the basic stuff that was happening because there was just so much information. But no, generally speaking, I don't DNF nearly as often as I should, and I would like to get better at it. Number 16. Should the author's personal life matter at all? I think it really depends on how much you're willing to engage with the work. Most books can be enjoyed just fine without having any deeper context about the person who wrote them, but I think it helps to know, in some cases, what the author was like and, you know, how their lives influenced their writing. Emily Bronte experienced a lot of really sudden illnesses and deaths in her family. So when you're reading Wuthering Heights and it seems like every second character gets sick with something and just dies, you learn through Emily Bronte's life just how prevalent these diseases were. Like, it hit a family and bam, there goes mom. Or when you're reading someone like Tolkien, it helps to know that he was a linguist. And then when it comes to ideological works like Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness or the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, it helps to know that those people were insufferable hypocrites who didn't always practice what they preached. So I think it can help inform the work, but it's not necessary. Now, when it comes to things like cancel culture or authors with deplorable opinions or they've done something terrible, I still think that you shouldn't disregard their work and just avoid reading it or engaging with it altogether. However, I can understand not wanting to support certain creators financially. Like, one of my all-time favorite film directors has done unspeakable things and still is not in prison. He should be extradited back to the States and put in jail. I still love his movies, but I will not spend $1 on him because he's still getting royalties. I'd rather still consume the media without directly financially contributing to the person. And with the magic of technology and the internet, it's very possible to do that if you want to. So yeah. When it comes to the author's personal life, I think it depends on how much you're willing to engage with the work and how you feel about financially supporting them. Number 17. If you could only read one genre for the rest of time, what would it be? I would definitely choose history books because history has a way of sort of intersecting with everything. Like, you'll understand how the world works, where things come from, how things like evolution work, how things like science and the development of the arts works, things like that. So like biography falls into it, and a lot of novels are also very important historically. So history has a way of affecting everything and being sort of involved with everything. So that's what I would choose as my one genre. Number 18. Do you ever read a book without knowing anything about it? I feel like I've already answered this one, but I'll give a little refresher. I tend to not go into any books blind. I tend to want to know things like the book's reputation, and its influence, and significance, and just little things like that. Even when it's something like the artwork that pulls me in, I'll still want to know a little bit about it before But I don't know, maybe that's something I should try sometime soon, is like just pick a book, boop, and like randomly read it. But I don't know, I feel like I need to know a little something just to tantalize me at the very least. Number 19. Which author, genre, series, or culture can you just not get into, and why? Oh my gosh, there's so many. I can't get into Lord of the Rings. I can't get into Song of Ice and Fire. I can't get into Dune. I can't get into superhero comics, MCU movies. I can't get into self-help books. I can't get into... But even though there's a lot of things that I may not be gangbusters about, I never give up and I never write off entire genres. People were telling me that I shouldn't read any more fantasy because I didn't like Lord of the Rings, so how can I like fantasy? But I persisted and I ended up finding some real diamonds in the rough that I really enjoyed, and I'm so glad that I persisted because you never know what you're going to find. And even when I may not get into all the big things that people are always talking about, I always have faith that I'll find some kind of niche where I'll be happy. Number 20. Do you think everyone should read, and why? This seems like a bit of a repeat of question 7, although it's a little more general, and like question number 7, my answer's the same. Yes, it's ideal, it's encouraged that you read, but don't beat yourself up if you're not able to read for whatever reason. I understand it takes a lot of time, and I understand a lot of people have learning disabilities that prevent them from being able to read a book cover to cover. But I would urge some of those people to try and push themselves, because I know of a handful of people with learning disabilities who never finished a book until they were in their 20s, and suddenly it just clicked for them because they were pulled in by, I don't know, by a franchise, and it made them read the book version, and then they were like, oh wow, I'm actually getting it. So yeah, I would encourage like doing what you can to try and engage with the written word. And sometimes that won't mean literally reading. Sometimes that'll mean having the work read to you via audiobook, for example. Or maybe it'll mean reading shorter things like blogs or Twitter posts or short news articles, things like that. So yeah, basically you should do what's best for you, obviously, but yeah, if you're able to read at all and if you're thinking about it, yeah, it's definitely encouraged that you read. Okay, so that's it. That is 20 questions about the philosophy of reading. That is the first tag I've done in a long time, so I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, do the liking and subscribing and all that shit if you really want to, but I don't know how often I post videos. It's pretty random, so I don't know. If you enjoyed, let me know, and if you want to answer any of the questions in your own video or in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to, like, a lot of these are great questions, which is why I did the tag at all, and I'm honestly curious to see how other people answer them. But yeah, that's it for now. See ya later.